The inheritance stays with the White family now, Rashad. You may leave. My father-in-law William Patterson's words echoed through the silent room as the last funeral guests said their goodbyes in the front yard. I stood in the kitchen doorway of the Victorian house Sarah and I had called home for 12 years, still wearing my black suit from the cemetery. The scent of funeral flowers mingled with the aroma of coffee that the neighbors had prepared for the mourners. "Excuse me." My voice came out more controlled than I expected, considering that my wife had been buried just 3 hours earlier. William turned to face me, his blue eyes cold as ice. Behind him, my brothers-in-law Robert and James stopped arranging the expensive china Sarah had inherited from her grandmother. The tension in the air was as thick as the August humidity in Virginia. "You heard me perfectly well," William continued, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. "This property has belonged to the Patterson family for 4 generations. Sarah is gone, God rest her soul, and now things are returning to their natural order. My name is Rashad Johnson. I am 43 years old, and until today I believed I knew my limits. I was born and raised in Richmond, the son of a mechanic and an elementary school teacher. I worked hard to earn a degree in civil engineering, built a respected construction company, and married the most amazing woman I've ever known. Sarah Patterson Johnson was everything her family was not: kind, inclusive, and completely free of the prejudices that infected the Patterson family tree like an ancestral plague. Rashad isn't going anywhere, Dad. Sarah's voice echoed in my memory, from a similar discussion we had 2 years ago, when William first suggested that I might not fit into the family's long-term plans. But Sarah was no longer here to defend me. Cancer had taken my wife, my best friend, and my only ally in this family in just 8 months. "The property documents are quite clear," James added, his voice carrying the same arrogance he had inherited from his father. "Family property goes back to the family. That's how it's always been." I watched the 3 men in front of me, noticing how they had strategically positioned themselves between me and the staircase leading to the second floor, where our bedrooms were. Bedrooms that still smelled of Sarah's perfume. Rooms where her clothes still hung in the closet like ghostly reminders of our interrupted life. "You have until Monday to collect your personal belongings," Robert added, consulting his gold Rolex. "We'll be generous and give you 3 days. That seems like enough time." Part of me wanted to explode. I wanted to scream that this house was mine too, that I had painted every wall, fixed every leaky faucet, planted every rose in the garden that Sarah loved so much. I wanted to remind them that I had held her hand through every chemotherapy session, while they only showed up on Sundays for mandatory dinners. But I did none of that. Instead, I nodded slowly, as if processing inevitable information. "I understand your position," I said calmly, watching the immediate relief cross their faces. They had expected a fight. They had expected tears, protests, or maybe even violence. What they hadn't expected was my almost serene composure in the face of what they clearly considered an easy victory. Well, William seemed genuinely surprised by my reaction. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this, Rashad. It will make things easier for everyone." I smiled. A small, almost imperceptible smile, but one that carried information they would never be able to decode. "You have no idea how easy this is going to be," I muttered, picking up my keys from the marble counter. As I walked toward the door, I heard Robert whisper to James, "Easier than we thought." I thought he was going to cause trouble. If this story of prejudice and the fight for justice is touching your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a funeral would turn into the first act of the most spectacular downfall Richmond had ever witnessed. Because what the Pattersons didn't know was that Sarah and I had spent the last 2 years preparing for this very moment. And Monday would be much more interesting than they imagined. The arrogance in William Patterson's voice was nothing new. During 12 years of marriage, I had witnessed that same condescending tone at countless family dinners, business meetings, and social events where my presence was tolerated by Sarah but never genuinely accepted. William Patterson was the closest thing Richmond had to Southern royalty. Descended from a lineage that prided itself on its 18th-century tobacco plantations, he had transformed the family inheritance into a real estate empire that dominated the historic center of the city. At 68, he maintained the upright posture of someone who had never been questioned about his convictions, especially those related to the purity of his family lineage. "Rashad always knew his place in this family," he had told Sarah 2 years ago during an argument I overheard through the office door. Provisional. Sarah had exploded on that occasion. "My place is beside my husband, Father. And if you can't accept that, Maybe you're the one who needs to re-evaluate your place in our lives. But Sarah was no longer here to defend me. Robert, the eldest son, had inherited not only his father's business, but also his ability to turn prejudice into family policy. At 45, he managed the Patterson commercial properties with the cold efficiency of someone who viewed relationships as temporary contracts. During the last months of Sarah's illness, Robert had visited our home 3 times, not to support his sister, but to evaluate necessary changes to the property. James, 2 years younger, was the family strategist. A lawyer specializing in estate law, he had spent the last decade creating legal structures to ensure that the Pattersons' wealth remained where it belonged. His visits during Sarah's chemotherapy always included conversations about succession planning and family asset protection. "You understand, Rashad," James had said during one of these visits, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses while Sarah slept in the next room. "Properties like this carry responsibilities that go beyond personal feelings. They are legacies that must be preserved for the right generations." The right generations. The code they used when they didn't want to say openly that my eventual children with Sarah would never be considered true Patterson heirs. The first sign that I would never be accepted came while we were still dating. Sarah had taken me to meet her family during Christmas 2011. I was nervous but confident. After all, my construction company was thriving, I had a college degree, and most importantly, I was madly in love with his daughter. The conversation stopped when I entered the room. Literally. William was telling a story about a client who had improved his life by marrying well, and his voice simply faded away when he saw my hand intertwined with Sarah's. "Dad, this is Rashad," Sarah had announced, her voice carrying that determination I would learn to recognize as her battle tone. "The man I've told you so much about." William had greeted me with a calculatedly firm handshake, his blue eyes sizing me up as if I were a piece of furniture his daughter had brought home and he needed to decide whether it matched the decor. "Rashad," he had repeated my name slowly, as if tasting something unpleasant. "What an interesting name. Is it Arabic?" "Actually, it means well-guided in Arabic," I replied calmly, accustomed to the question. "My parents chose it because they wanted me to have direction in life." "How thoughtful," Patricia had murmured from the armchair, her voice carrying the kind of icy courtesy that Southern ladies had mastered as an art. "And your parents, Rashad? What do they do?" Sarah had warned me about that question. The subtle investigation into my background was a mandatory ritual in Richmond society. My father was a mechanic, my mother an elementary school teacher, hardworking, honest people who had sacrificed a great deal to give me a college education. My father owns an auto repair shop on the South Side, and my mother has taught at John Marshall Elementary School for 23 years, I replied with genuine pride. The silence that followed was eloquent. Robert coughed discreetly. James found something fascinating at the bottom of his bourbon glass. Patricia adjusted her pearls as if they could protect her from some social discomfort. "How admirable," William finally said, and I knew I had failed the test. For the next 12 years, this dynamic never fundamentally changed. I was accepted at family gatherings because Sarah insisted, tolerated in business because my company had become respected, and included in conversations because Southern politeness demanded superficial courtesy. But always with the unspoken understanding that my presence was conditional. The true nature of that conditionality became clear during Sarah's illness. While I spent nights at the hospital holding her hand during chemotherapy sessions, the Pattersons made their own plans. Conversations that stopped when I arrived. Family gatherings to which I was not invited. Documents that James brought for Sarah to sign to organize practical matters. "They're preparing for my departure," Sarah had confessed to me one night, her eyes still bright despite the weakness caused by the treatment. "Dad thinks that when I'm gone, you'll just disappear." "And you? What do you think?" I asked, arranging the pillows behind her. She smiled with that determination that made me fall in love with her from the first time we met. "I think he doesn't know you as well as he thinks he does." Now, standing at the entrance to the kitchen of the house that Sarah and I had made our home, watching 3 white men divide our life as if it were their rightful inheritance, I finally understood completely what my wife had been trying to tell me. They weren't just taking property. They were exercising what they considered their ancestral right to determine who belonged to what. In their minds, my marriage to Sarah had been a temporary aberration that death had finally corrected. "The deeds to the house have been in the Patterson name for 4 generations, Robert explained as he stacked plates from our dining table. "Sarah had right of use while she lived, but that doesn't transfer to others. Others. The word hung in the air like toxic smoke. You surely understand the legal complexities, James added, consulting his Rolex. Family properties have specific statutes regarding inheritance. Sarah, poor thing, probably never explained these nuances to you. What they didn't know, what none of them ever imagined, was that Sarah had explained much more than they could ever conceive. And over the past 2 years, especially after the diagnosis made our conversations about the future more urgent, we had planned for this very moment. But I let them continue to believe their version of the story. I let them feel smart, superior, victorious. Because the most devastating revenge is the one the target builds with their own hands, convinced they are building their triumph. I understand your position perfectly, I repeated, picking up the keys from the counter. Monday will be enlightening for all of us. As I walked toward the car, I heard William say to Robert, easier than I imagined. I thought we would have problems. If they knew what Sarah and I had been preparing for the past 2 years, they would understand that trouble was exactly what they were going to face. But trouble of a completely different nature than they imagined. Because on Monday, they would discover that underestimating an educated black man and a determined white woman had been the most costly mistake the Patterson family had made in 4 generations. 3 days after the funeral, I discovered how deep the Pattersons' plans ran. I was organizing Sarah's personal papers when my phone rang. It was Jennifer Martinez, our family lawyer and one of the few true friends Sarah had kept from college. Rashad, I need to see you urgently. Her voice carried a tension I had never heard before. Not over the phone. Can you come to my office now? 40 minutes later, sitting in Jennifer's conference room, I discovered that the situation was even worse than I had imagined. They contacted me yesterday, Jennifer said, sliding an official letter across the table. They're contesting Sarah's will. My stomach sank as I read the header, Petition for Will Annulment due to undue influence and mental incapacity. The signature at the bottom was James Patterson, representing the family. Undue influence? My voice came out hoarser than usual. They're claiming that you manipulated Sarah during her illness to alter her original wishes, Jennifer explained, her brown eyes flashing with indignation. They want to prove that she was mentally incapacitated when she made the changes to the will. It was a brutal but clever strategy. Attacking Sarah's mental legitimacy during her battle with cancer would be devastating to any legal defense. And at the same time, it would destroy the memory of the woman I loved. There's more, Jennifer continued, opening another folder. I received calls from 3 different companies today. All canceling contracts with your construction company. Apparently, there have been changes in project requirements. The pattern became clear instantly. The Pattersons weren't just fighting for the property. They were systematically destroying my ability to defend myself financially. Without contracts, I wouldn't have the resources for a protracted legal battle. Jennifer, how long do we have before the hearing? 6 weeks. But Rashad, I need to be honest with you. They have unlimited resources and connections throughout the Richmond court system. James knows half the judges in the city personally. I left Jennifer's office with a weight on my chest that had nothing to do with grief. It was the cold realization that the Pattersons had turned my life into a battlefield where I was fighting alone against an army. That night, sitting in the empty kitchen of the house Sarah and I had called home, I allowed myself a moment of real despair. The walls were covered with photographs of our life together, our honeymoon in the Caribbean, last Christmas when Sarah was still strong, the day we bought our first car together. Each image was a reminder that I had lost not only my wife, but also my identity as part of something bigger. The Pattersons weren't just taking property, they were erasing any evidence that Rashad and Sarah Johnson had ever existed as a family. That's when I found the letter. It was hidden inside Sarah's recipe book, that stained volume she used to experiment with dishes during our early years of marriage. A sealed letter with my name written in the delicate handwriting I would recognize anywhere. My dear Rashad, it began. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and my family has finally shown its true colors. I hope they waited at least until after the funeral to be completely horrible. Even on paper, Sarah's personality shone through. Her dry sense of humor mixed with that uncanny intuition that had always impressed me. I know you're feeling alone right now, wondering if you can fight them. Let me save you some time, you can. And you will win. Because for the past 2 years, while we pretended everything was normal during family dinners, we were building something they would never expect. My heart raced. During the last months of Sarah's illness, she had insisted on long conversations about our long-term strategy. I had assumed they were delusions caused by pain medication. Remember the locked drawer in my office? The one you always asked about, and I said were just boring documents? The key is hidden inside the frame of our wedding photo. Open that drawer when you're ready to discover that you're not fighting alone. My hands trembled as I walked to Sarah's office. The silver frame of our wedding photo had been on her desk for 8 years. I had never thought to examine it closely. On the back, I found a small compartment that opened with light pressure. Inside was a small gold key. The locked drawer revealed itself to be a library of war. Files organized chronologically, each labeled with dates and names. Racist comments, 2019 to 2021. Family exclusion, photographic documentation. Recorded conversations, legal consent verified. There were audio recordings of family dinners where the Pattersons made comments about my race when they thought Sarah wasn't listening. Photographs of family events where I had been strategically excluded or placed on the edges of photos. Emails between James and Robert discussing the Rashad problem and strategies to discourage me. But the thickest folder was labeled Richmond Project, Documentary Evidence. Inside, I found 3 years of meticulous research into questionable business practices by the Patterson Company. Bribes to city officials to secure zoning approvals. Building code violations systematically ignored through strategic donations. Manipulation of public contracts through political connections. Sarah had documented everything. Every suspicious transaction, every political favor, every scheme that allowed the Pattersons to maintain their real estate empire through methods that bordered on illegality. In the last folder was a letter addressed not to me, but to the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. Dear Attorney Williams, the letter began in Sarah's formal handwriting. I am enclosing evidence of a systematic pattern of municipal corruption involving the Patterson family and several Richmond public officials. As a concerned resident and dying citizen, I feel compelled to ensure that this information reaches the appropriate authorities after my death. Sarah had prepared a complete dossier to destroy not only the Pattersons' reputation, but also their ability to operate their corrupt businesses. And she had left the final decision up to me. The final letter in the package was personal. Rashad, you now have the tools to defend yourself. But more importantly, you have the tools to ensure that they never do to anyone else what they did to us. The choice is yours. If you decide to fight, know that it will be a war. But it will be a war you can win. Sitting in Sarah's office, surrounded by evidence of years of secret planning, I finally understood the extent of the gift my wife had left me. It wasn't just legal protection or incriminating evidence. It was power. The kind of power that comes from knowing exactly where your enemies are most vulnerable. The kind of power that turns victims into predators and turns injustice into inevitable retribution. I picked up my phone and dialed Jennifer Martinez's number. Jennifer, it's me. I need to set up a meeting with the U.S. Attorney. I have some information he'll find very interesting. As I waited for her to answer, I looked out the office window at Richmond lit up at night. Somewhere in this city, the Pattersons were probably celebrating their anticipated victory, confident that they had effectively neutralized the racial problem that had complicated their lives for 12 years. They had no idea that Sarah had spent 2 years turning her own funeral into a starting line for their complete destruction. And on Monday, when they arrived to formalize my eviction from the house, they would discover that the black man they thought they had defeated had access to information that could send the entire Patterson family to federal prison. The war they had started was about to become a bloodbath they would never forget. The meeting with U.S. Attorney Thomas Williams took place the following Wednesday in an inconspicuous building in downtown Richmond. Jennifer accompanied me, carrying 2 bulky folders containing the evidence Sarah had meticulously compiled. Mr. Johnson, Williams said as he leafed through the documents, his glasses reflecting the light from the table. Your wife was thorough. Sarah was a veterinarian, but she also had a background in accounting, I explained, watching him examine photographs of secret meetings between James Patterson and the city's zoning director. She knew exactly what to look for. Williams paused at a specific recording. This conversation between Robert Patterson and Councilman Thompson about the Broad Street project. That's outright bribery. No ambiguity. Sarah recorded this during a family dinner, Jennifer added. She had legal consent because she was in her own home when Robert called on speakerphone. The prosecutor closed the folder and looked me straight in the eye. Mr. Johnson, this material is sufficient for a full federal investigation. But I need you to understand, once we start, there's no turning back. The Pattersons will find out that the information came from you. They've already declared war on me, I replied calmly. The only difference is that now I have ammunition. I left that building with the promise that an investigation would be opened within 48 hours. But I knew this was only the first move in a much more complex game. That afternoon, I implemented the second phase of the plan Sarah and I had discussed during her last weeks. I called Marcus Chun, my accountant and the only friend Sarah had approved during our 12 years of marriage. Rashad, man, I'm so sorry about Sarah, Marcus said when we met at his office. She was special. But you seem determined. Marcus, I need you to look at something for me. I handed him copies of the contracts James had forced me to sign 3 years earlier when my company provided services for a Patterson project. Sarah discovered a clause buried in these documents that James thought I would never notice. Marcus adjusted his glasses and began to read. After 20 minutes, he looked up with a puzzled expression. Rashad, did you see Section 12B? The shared liability clause. Sarah specifically marked it. What does it mean? It means that any irregularities in the projects your company worked on make you legally co-liable, but it also means you have the right to a full audit of all related financial records. Marcus smiled slowly. James was too smart for his own good. He wanted to protect the family from future problems, but he ended up giving you legal access to information that would normally be confidential. It was brilliant. Sarah had realized that James, in his arrogance, had created a mechanism that could be used against his own family. While Marcus prepared the legal audit requests, I implemented the third phase, psychological information. I called Patricia Patterson. Rashad, dear, her voice carried that false sympathy I had learned to recognize. How are you coping with everything? I'm fine, Patricia. Actually, I was thinking of organizing a small memorial service for Sarah. Just close family, you know. Maybe next Saturday. Oh, how thoughtful. Of course we'll be there. Perfect. And Patricia? Sarah left some personal letters for each member of the family. I thought I'd hand them out during the ceremony. The silence on the other end of the line was revealing. Letters. Yes, you know how sentimental Sarah was. She wrote personal messages to each of us during her last months. In fact, the only letters Sarah had left were the evidence for the federal prosecutor. But the Pattersons didn't know that. And the possibility that their private conversations might have been documented would make them paranoid for the next few days. On Friday, 2 days before the memorial service I had invented, James called me. Rashad, we need to talk. In person. Sure, James. What about? About some legal concerns that have come up. Maybe we can work something out amicably. We met at a discreet cafe in Short Pump. James arrived with Robert, both visibly tense. Rashad, James began, fidgeting nervously with his wedding ring. Perhaps we were hasty about the property issue. What do you mean? Well, considering that you and Sarah were married for so long, there may be rights that we haven't properly considered. Robert added, we were thinking that perhaps a financial settlement would be more appropriate. Something that would recognize your contribution to Sarah's well-being. It was exactly what Sarah had predicted. When pressed, they would try to buy my silence rather than face a public legal battle. What kind of settlement do you have in mind? James slid an envelope across the table. $500,000. In exchange, you sign a complete waiver of any claim to the Patterson estate and agree to keep private any family conversations you may have witnessed. $500,000. It was a significant amount, but it also revealed how desperate they were. If they were willing to pay $500,000 for my silence, it meant they had much more to lose. It's a generous offer, I said calmly. Can I have a few days to consider it? Of course, Robert replied quickly. But we'd prefer to settle this before Monday. Monday. The deadline they had originally given me to leave the house. They still thought they controlled the timeline. I understand. I'll give you an answer by Sunday. I left that cafe with the confirmation that my plan was working perfectly. The Pattersons were scared enough to offer a bribe, but still arrogant enough to believe that money would solve their problems. That night, I finalized preparations for Saturday's memorial service. It wouldn't just be a sham to scare the Pattersons, it would be the perfect setting for the first public act of their downfall. I called all of Sarah's friends and colleagues who had been systematically excluded from family events during our marriage. Dr. Williams, who had treated Sarah during her cancer. Professor Martinez, Sarah's advisor in veterinary school. Michelle Santos, Sarah's best friend since childhood. If you're following this story of injustice and revenge, don't miss the next episodes. Subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple memorial would become the stage for the most public humiliation Richmond had ever witnessed. Every person I called accepted the invitation immediately. They all had stories about how the Pattersons had treated them with contempt over the years. They were all eager to pay their last respects to Sarah in an environment where they would be genuinely welcome. What the Pattersons didn't know was that on Sunday morning, an hour before the memorial service, federal agents would be knocking on their doors with search and seizure warrants. And while they desperately tried to explain to their neighbors why FBI cars were parked in their driveways, I would be at the downtown Methodist church, surrounded by people who truly loved Sarah, reading aloud the letter she had written specifically for that moment. The letter that would publicly reveal not only the Pattersons' corruption, but also 12 years of systematic racism that they thought they had kept hidden. Monday would not be about my departure from the Pattersons' house. It would be about finding out if they would still have a home to return to. Sunday, 6:47 a.m. My phone rang with a call I had been waiting for 3 days. Rashad, this is Williams. We're on our way. 20 minutes. Federal prosecutor Thomas Williams always kept his word. While the Pattersons slept peacefully, confident that Monday would be the day of my final eviction, federal agents took up positions at 3 different addresses in Richmond. At 7:15 a.m., while having breakfast in the kitchen of the house Sarah and I had shared, I heard the first siren in the distance. The sound grew louder until 3 black cars pulled up in front of the Patterson mansion, just 6 blocks away. My phone rang again. It was James. Rashad, what the hell is going on? The FBI is at my house. Good morning, James. How can I help you? They have search warrants. They're saying there's a federal investigation into corrupt business practices. Do you know anything about this? I kept my voice perfectly calm. James, why would I know anything about federal investigations? I heard agitated voices in the background, orders being given, drawers being opened. Rashad, they specifically mentioned documents related to the Broad Street project. The one your company worked with us on. Oh yes. I remember that project. I hope everything is in order. Listen, James's voice was becoming desperate. About our conversation on Friday. The $500,000 offer still stands. In fact, we can go up to $750,000 if you can. Clarify a few things for the authorities. Now he was offering outright bribery. Sarah had predicted this too. James, I'm afraid it's too late for financial agreements. What do you mean, too late? At 8:30 a.m., at Central Methodist Church, I will be reading a letter that Sarah left specifically for this moment. A letter detailing 12 years of systematic racism by the Patterson family. The press has been invited. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Rashad, you can't, we're family. Family. My voice finally carried the emotion I had been holding back for 3 days. James, you kicked me out of the house the day after my wife's funeral. You said the inheritance was only for the white family. Remember? That was a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding, James. It was racism. And Sarah documented every instance over 2 years. I hung up and headed to the church. Central Methodist Church was packed when I arrived. Dr. Williams had brought the entire medical team that had treated Sarah. Professor Martinez came with colleagues from the veterinary school. Michelle Santos arrived with a group of Sarah's childhood friends whom the Pattersons had always excluded from family events. But what struck me most was seeing people I didn't even know. Neighbors who had witnessed years of disrespectful treatment. Sarah's co-workers who had their own stories about racist comments they heard during visits to the veterinary clinic. At 8:30 sharp, I stepped up to the pulpit. Thank you all for coming to honor the memory of Sarah Patterson Johnson, I began, emphasizing her full married name. My wife left a specific letter to be read today. A letter about truth, justice, and courage. In the third row, 2 reporters from the Richmond Times-Dispatch took notes. In the fifth row, a cameraman from WRIC-TV was discreetly recording. Dear friends, I began reading Sarah's letter. If Rashad is reading this, it means that my family has finally shown its true colors. For 2 years, I have systematically documented the racism my husband faced in our family. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. Because someone had to speak up for those who were silenced. The letter continued for 4 pages, detailing specific instances. Christmas 2019, when William said that people like Rashad didn't understand family traditions. The 2020 birthday, when Patricia suggested that Sarah could have chosen better if she wanted children who fit in with the family. The 2021 business meeting, when Robert publicly questioned whether I had real qualifications or had only gotten contracts because of diversity policies. Each paragraph was a bombshell, backed up by dates, times, and in some cases recordings. When I finished reading, the silence in the church was absolute. It was broken by my phone ringing. William Patterson. I answered on speakerphone. Rashad, you destroyed our family. His voice was hoarse, probably from yelling at the federal agents. 40 years of building our reputation, and you destroyed it all. William, I replied calmly, you destroyed your own reputation. Sarah and I just documented it. We took you in. We gave you opportunities. You tolerated me for Sarah's sake. There's a difference. Dr. Williams stood up in the second row. Mr. Patterson, I'm Dr. Williams. I treated Sarah during her last months. I personally witnessed how your family pressured her to reconsider her will. Your wife was visibly distressed after phone conversations with you. Professor Martinez joined him. And I am Professor Martinez. Sarah told me about her family's suggestions, that she leave the property where it should stay. She was tormented by your last wishes. Michelle Santos stood up. Sarah was my best friend for 20 years. She told me that you began planning Rashad's expulsion at the time of her diagnosis. While she was fighting cancer, you were planning her inheritance. The phone was still on speaker. William could hear every word. That's not true. William, my voice cut through his denials. On Monday, when you came to evict me from my home, I was prepared. Sarah left me not only evidence of your corporate corruption, but also complete documentation of 12 years of family racism. You're bluffing. Actually, I'm not. Federal Agent Davis, can you confirm the allegations against the Patterson family? A new voice echoed through the speakerphone. The agent had arrived at the church. Mr. Patterson, based on evidence provided by documents left by your late daughter, there are arrest warrants out for you, Robert Patterson, and James Patterson for conspiracy, bribery of public officials, and federal tax fraud. You have the right to remain silent. The phone hung up. Agent Davis approached the pulpit. Mr. Johnson, we need you to come with us to finalize your official statement. As I walked down the aisle, applause slowly began and turned into a standing ovation. It wasn't applause for me, but for Sarah. For the woman who had stood up to her own family to protect the man she loved. Outside the church, 3 news vans were parked. The story of the Patterson family, a Richmond dynasty brought down by racism and corruption, would be headline news for weeks. But as reporters shouted questions, my mind was focused on a single truth. Sarah had turned her own death into the catalyst for justice she had been unable to achieve in life. The Pattersons had completely underestimated the power of a dying woman determined to protect the man she loved. And now they would face the consequences of a war they themselves had declared, but never had a chance of winning. The real twist wasn't that I had won. It was that Sarah had orchestrated her own posthumous revenge with a precision that would impress the best military strategists. 6 months later, Richmond was never the same. The Patterson trial became the biggest corruption scandal in the city's history. William was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Robert lost his real estate license and faced charges of tax evasion. James was disbarred and fined $2 million. But true justice came through the social consequences. Patricia Patterson, who had spent 40 years building her reputation as a Richmond socialite, found herself completely ostracized. The country club canceled her lifetime membership. Charitable organizations removed her name from plaques and events. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid conversation. The Patterson mansion was mortgaged to pay the legal fines. Gerald had to cancel his plans to move when he discovered that his parents' house was being seized by the federal government. As for me, Sarah had left me more than evidence and legal protection. She had left me complete freedom to rebuild my life exactly as I chose. I sold the Victorian house, not out of necessity, but by choice. Every room carried painful memories of Sarah's last months, mixed with echoes of 12 years of silent family battles. With the money from the sale and the contracts that returned after the Patterson corruption was exposed, expanding my construction company became inevitable. Today, Johnson Construction employs 43 people and specializes in affordable housing projects, exactly the kind of work the Pattersons always despised. Dr. Williams came to see me 3 months after the trial. "Rashad, Sarah asked me to give you this if you survived the first year," he said, handing me a final envelope. The letter was typical Sarah, practical, loving, and visionary. "If you're reading this, it means my plan worked and you're free to live the life you've always deserved. Don't waste time on bitterness. Use your freedom to build something beautiful. Love again when you're ready. And remember, you didn't just win a battle, you proved that dignity and intelligence always triumph over prejudice and arrogance." Today, when I pass by the old Patterson mansion, now a community center run by the city, I think about the power of underestimating people based on skin color, social background, or any other superficial prejudice. Sarah taught her family a lesson that cost them everything. True love protects beyond death, and the most powerful revenge is justice built with patience, evidence, and absolute determination. The Pattersons thought they were expelling a black man from the white family. They discovered they were freeing someone who carried the tools of their own destruction. Michelle Santos called me last week. "Sarah would be proud," she said. "You turned pain into purpose." She was right. Every housing project I build, every family I help find a decent home, every young black person I hire and train at my company, all of this is a continuation of the battle Sarah started. If this story of resilience and justice has inspired you to never give up in the face of prejudice, subscribe to the channel for more real stories of people who have turned injustice into victory. The last time I saw William Patterson, he was being escorted to prison transport after sentencing. Our eyes met for a moment through the bulletproof glass. I felt neither anger nor satisfaction. I felt pity. Because while he lost decades of freedom paying for his hatred, I gained a lifetime of meaning honoring Sarah's love. In the end, the legacy that really mattered wasn't the Victorian house or the family estate. It was the lesson that true power comes from knowing exactly who you are and never allowing others to define your worth. And that legacy, no prejudice in the world can steal.